In the quiet corridors of Brookstone Academy, a prestigious institution nestled in a suburban American town, the echoes of youthful laughter bounced off pristine walls painted in hues of white and beige. Rows of polished lockers lined the hallways, and motivational quotes adorned bulletin boards, reflecting an outward image of unity and excellence. But beneath the surface of the school's polished image lay the lingering residue of deep-rooted prejudice, subtly woven into its fabric, often invisible to those who did not feel its sting. It was in this setting that a young girl named Amara James walked with her books clutched tightly to her chest, her steps measured and her eyes lowered, just enough to seem humble but not afraid. Amara was a 15-year-old black student in her sophomore year, known for her sharp intellect, articulate speech, and an unruly crown of curly hair that she wore proudly. Despite the stares and whispers it often attracted, Amara's presence in the advanced placement classes was not just rare, but questioned silently by some and loudly by others who masked their discomfort with condescension. She excelled in mathematics, science, and literature, often topping exams and projects with a consistency that both impressed and unsettled. Her teachers acknowledged her brilliance, but some did so with a hesitation that betrayed their biases. None more so than Mrs. Karen Whitmore, a veteran English teacher whose crisp attire and stern demeanor demanded respect. She carried herself with an air of superiority rooted in tradition, a belief in order, discipline, and an unspoken idea of what excellence should look like. To Mrs. Whitmore, Amara was a contradiction she couldn't reconcile. She was smart, too smart, in fact, for someone like her. Her curly hair, voluminous and free, was often deemed distracting in Mrs. Whitmore's classroom. Her assertiveness was labeled as disruptive, while the same tone from others was called confident. It began subtly, with comments laced in concern, suggestions to tie her hair back more neatly, remarks about her writing being too ambitious or too opinionated. When Amara used advanced vocabulary, Mrs. Whitmore would raise an eyebrow, questioning whether the words were truly hers. The other students began to notice the pattern. Some whispered, some laughed, and a few began to mirror the teachers. Skepticism Amara felt it. The sting of being unseen for who she truly was. The ache of constantly having to prove herself in a room where she should have felt safe. She spent hours after school perfecting essays, rechecking equations, and reading ahead, not just for the joy of learning, but to armor herself against the doubt cast on her every achievement. Her mother, Danielle James, a former civil rights lawyer turned community organizer, saw the changes in her daughter's demeanor. The once bold girl now hesitated before speaking, weighed her words too carefully, and asked questions like, "Do I talk too much in class?" Danielle listened, held her close, and reminded her of the lineage she came from, of ancestors who had walked through fire so she could stand tall. But even the strongest affirmations from home could not completely shield Amara from the poison that seeped into her daily life through subtle cuts and pointed stares. The tipping point came during the mid-semester presentation in English class. Each student was tasked with delivering a speech on a literary figure that inspired them. Amara chose Maya Angelou, weaving a narrative that was both poetic and profound. Her delivery was flawless, her presence commanding, her analysis deep and emotional. The class erupted in applause, some students visibly moved. But Mrs. Whitmore stood with her arms crossed and a tight-lipped smile. When it came time to grade the presentations, Amara received a B-. The feedback read, "Lacked originality and excessive dramatization. Consider simplifying future work to match academic standards." Amara's heart sank. It wasn't the grade that hurt. It was the implication that her truth, her voice, her story were somehow less valid. Danielle requested a meeting with the school administration. The principal, Mr. Carlson, a well-meaning man who often tiptoed around conflict, listened with a furrowed brow and nodded sympathetically. He assured them that Mrs. Whitmore was a respected educator and that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. Danielle, composed yet firm, recounted the pattern of microaggressions, the disproportionate criticism, and the emotional toll on her daughter. Mr. Carlson promised to look into it, but offered no timeline, no follow-up plan, only the vague comfort of procedural review. Amara returned to school the next day, her head held high, her curls bouncing defiantly with each step. But the atmosphere was different. Whispers grew louder, her peers more distant. Some accused her of playing the race card, others mocked her for complaining. Mrs. Whitmore carried on as if nothing had happened, but her tone grew colder, her scrutiny sharper. Despite it all, Amara refused to break. She turned her pain into purpose, channeling her frustration into her writing. Her next essay wasn't about literature, but about the lived experience of being black in a place that pretended to be colorblind. It was raw, emotional, and piercingly honest. She didn't write it for a grade. She wrote it for herself, for every student who had ever been made to feel less than. She read it aloud at the school's annual creative showcase. The auditorium fell silent as her words painted a picture too vivid to ignore. Some teachers looked away. Some students cried. And when she finished, the silence turned into a standing ovation, except from one corner, where Mrs. Whitmore sat with her arms folded, her eyes unreadable. The showcase sparked conversations across the school. Some students began sharing their own stories. Teachers formed a committee to examine racial bias in CY classrooms. The local paper ran an article on student voices challenging the status quo. Amara became a reluctant symbol of change, not because she wanted the spotlight, but because her story echoed a truth too long ignored. She didn't claim to speak for all black students, but in telling her story, she created a space where others felt safe to tell theirs. And though Mrs. Whitmore never publicly addressed the essay or her past actions, her grading became more tempered, her criticisms less harsh. Perhaps she was changing. Perhaps she was just being careful. Amara didn't care for apologies not spoken. She knew the real battle wasn't in one classroom or one essay. It was in the slow, daily push against a system that had never been designed with her in mind. But she also knew she wasn't alone. That her voice, once questioned, now carried weight. That her hair, once called a distraction, was now her silent protest. And that her brilliance, once doubted, had become undeniable. In the hallways of Brookstone Academy, the echoes of change had begun. Not loud, not sudden, but real. The quiet after the storm was unsettling. While Amara's essay at the creative showcase had sparked a ripple of awakening across Brookstone Academy, not all the echoes that followed were kind. Change, as it often does, brought resistance. There were parents who emailed the school, some applauding Amara's bravery, others questioning the appropriateness of her message. A few accused her of politicizing education. They used words like divisive and inappropriate. But Amara did not shrink. The fire that had been lit inside her refused to be extinguished. Still, the toll it took on her spirit was growing heavier each day. Classes became more tense. In Mrs. Whitmore's English class, the air was cold with unspoken accusations. The teacher's words were no longer sharp, but their absence held equal weight. No praise, no feedback. Just a clinical detachment that turned Amara invisible. She was no longer the student who needed correction. She was the student who needed ignoring. But Amara did not want validation. She wanted fairness. And it was becoming clearer that silence could be as oppressive as cruelty. At home, Danielle remained a fortress of support. She encouraged Amara to keep writing, to document everything, not for revenge, but for truth. Truth had power, Danielle would remind her. Truth exposes, truth heals. Amara began journaling daily, capturing moments both large and small. The sideways glances, the awkward silences when race was mentioned, the moments when teachers praised other students for repeating things she had already said. Her journal became her sanctuary. A place to unload the weight she carried and transform it into clarity. Then came the day of the school-wide essay competition. A prestigious annual event judged by a panel of teachers, administrators, and outside writers. The theme was Voices of the Future. Amara hesitated to enter. She feared the bias would follow her work, no matter how polished, no matter how powerful. But Danielle insisted, don't let them steal your light. So Amara wrote. Her essay was a vision of a school system that saw every student wholly. It was laced with personal anecdotes, thoughtful critique, and a resounding call for equity. She submitted it with quiet defiance. The results came 2 weeks later. First place went to a student whose essay quoted widely from philosophers but failed to touch any real emotion. Amara's name was not among the winners, but her essay was shared online by another teacher, Mr. Lewis, a history professor who had long admired her work. He asked Amara for permission to share it with a wider audience. The piece went viral in their local community. Then beyond, educators from other schools wrote in support. Journalists reached out for interviews. An education podcast invited Amara to speak. In days, she became more than a student. She became a symbol of what courage in the face of systemic injustice looked like. The newfound attention brought pride and pressure. She felt seen in ways she never had before, but being seen also meant being scrutinized. Some accused her of exaggerating. Some classmates distanced themselves. One student even vandalized her locker with the words "loud" and "liar" written in marker. The school investigated, but found no one responsible. Mr. Carlson assured her of support, but his actions remained cautious, calculated, performative. In contrast, Mr. Lewis became a mentor. He began meeting Amara during free periods, helping her refine her essays, guiding her toward scholarship opportunities, teaching her how to harness her voice for advocacy. He introduced her to authors who had changed the world with their words: James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, Ta-Nehisi Coates. She read voraciously, her mind expanding with each page. With every new word, she felt less alone. She realized that the fight she was in wasn't new. It was part of a legacy, a movement. But as Amara's light grew, Mrs. Whitmore's resentment deepened. During class discussions, she would now interrupt Amara's points to redirect the conversation. When group projects were assigned, Amara was placed with students who wouldn't contribute, subtly ensuring her workload doubled. Once, when Amara corrected a literary reference made by another student, Mrs. Whitmore chided her for being argumentative. The message was clear. Sit down. Be quiet. Know your place. Amara's grades in English began to slip, not from lack of effort, but from subjective rubrics and vague comments. She documented everything, each marked paper, each interaction. Danielle pushed for another meeting with the administration. This time she brought evidence. Marked essays from other students graded more leniently. Screenshots of similar work receiving different feedback. A written timeline of events. Mr. Carlson listened again. This time, so did the school board. A quiet internal review began. Mrs. Whitmore, though not suspended, was placed under observation. She knew it. Amara could feel the tension simmering in the classroom, but even in the face of this storm, Amara stood firm. She found solace in the few teachers and students who supported her. Her friend Emily, a white student with an activist mother, stood by her side publicly. She wrote a piece in the school paper defending Amara's right to speak out. Slowly, others followed. Not everyone, but enough to form a small circle of allies. They began organizing safe spaces for students to talk about race, bias, and belonging. They called it the Unheard Voices Club. What started as 5 students grew to 20 within a month. Amara, once alone in her fight, now found strength in solidarity. She led workshops, facilitated discussions, and helped other students craft their own narratives. One black student shared how he had been suspended twice for behavior that others weren't even reprimanded for. A Muslim girl spoke about being told her essays were too focused on culture. A Latina student shared how her accent became the reason teachers underestimated her. Each story was a piece of a larger puzzle, each voice a chorus growing louder. The administration could no longer pretend not to hear. Policies were reviewed. Bias training was introduced. Token steps, but steps nonetheless. Mrs. Whitmore's classroom was no longer a space where unchecked power could roam freely. And though she remained in her post, her actions were now watched closely. The veil of immunity had been lifted. For Amara, this wasn't a victory, but a shift. A sign that resistance bore fruit, however slow. But perhaps the most profound moment came during a regional school conference, where Amara had been invited to speak on youth leadership. Standing before hundreds of students and educators, she told her story, not with bitterness but with clarity. She spoke of pain, but also of purpose. She ended with a message that reverberated through the room. I don't need your pity. I don't need your permission. I just need your eyes open and your hearts willing. The applause was thunderous, and in that moment, Amara felt something she hadn't in a long time. Not pride, not relief, but peace. The kind that comes from knowing you are walking in truth. When she returned to Brookstone Academy the next day, she passed Mrs. Whitmore in the hallway. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged, but in that gaze was a silent acknowledgement. Amara was no longer the student who could be silenced. She was a young woman who had found her power. And nothing, not prejudice, not protocol, not fear, could take that away from her again. As the months passed at Brookstone Academy, the emotional toll on Amara began to manifest in subtler ways. She no longer lingered after class to ask questions or offer her thoughts with the same spark in her eyes. Instead, she would nod politely, fold into herself a little more, and hurry through the halls with a wary awareness of who might be watching. Though she had a circle of support growing around her, the experience of being targeted, judged, and underestimated because of something she could never and would never change about herself, her blackness, her brilliance. Her curls left behind wounds that took longer to surface than to cause Danielle noticed at first. Amara had grown quieter at home. Her journaling became less consistent. Sometimes she would sit at the kitchen table for hours, staring at a blank page, the words locked behind fatigue. Danielle didn't push. She waited. Gave her space, but the mother's heart within her grew heavier with each passing day. So one evening, over warm mugs of cocoa, Danielle sat across from her daughter and said softly, "You're allowed to be tired. You know you're allowed to rest, but don't let the world dim your light while you do." And Amara nodded, blinking away the tears that came. Without invitation, the school year rolled on exams, approached the Unheard Voices Club, met weekly with students pouring more energy into it than ever before. They created a zine filled with poems, essays, and artwork reflecting their experiences. Amara contributed a piece titled "The Weight of Silence" in it. She described what it felt like to walk into a room knowing people had already decided who you were without hearing your voice. It resonated deeply with other students, and copies of the zine circulated beyond Brookstone's walls, shared on social media, retweeted by activists, and even discussed in an education blog. Meanwhile, Mrs. Whitmore kept her distance. She followed protocol, marking papers and leading class discussions, but her energy was absent when Amara spoke. She didn't interrupt, but she didn't engage either. Her smiles toward other students remained, but they never reached Amara. There was a professional veneer to everything she did, now stripped of the subtle, biting comments, yet still steeped in a chilling detachment. Amara began to realize that not every oppressor screams, some simply stop seeing you. Despite this, Amara continued to thrive, academically bolstered by her alliance with Mr. Lewis. He helped her apply for summer programs and introduced her to professors at local universities. One day he pulled her aside with a proud smile and handed her a printed email. It was an acceptance letter to a prestigious young writers' retreat hosted by a top college. Amara read it 3 times, not because she doubted it was real, but because she needed to feel it to soak in the reality that her voice, once ignored, once silenced, was now her ticket to spaces once closed to her. Her classmates began to shift too. Conversations became more open. Students who once stayed silent started speaking up when they saw bias in class and beyond. Teachers were slowly becoming more thoughtful with their language, more mindful in how they interacted. The change was slow, imperfect, and incomplete, but it was real. And Amara, who had once felt alone in her pain, began to feel part of something greater. Her struggle had sparked a wave, and others were beginning to ride it. Then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Whitmore didn't show up to class one Monday morning nor the next. Rumors circulated. Some said she had taken a leave. Others whispered she was under investigation. No one confirmed anything. The administration remained silent. Mr. Lewis said only, "There are changes happening behind the scenes, some necessary conversations." Amara didn't feel triumph, just a strange, quiet emptiness. She hadn't wanted revenge. She wanted justice, clarity, growth. She didn't want to destroy anyone. She only wanted space to exist fully and freely. Her English class was now led by a substitute, Ms. Ray. a young teacher with energy and openness that brought new life into the classroom. Ms. Ray acknowledged Amara's leadership, immediately calling on her with genuine interest, asking her to share her opinions and praising her insights in a way that felt honest and affirming. It was the kind of teaching Amara had almost forgotten was possible with Miss Ray at the helm. The classroom felt like a place of ideas again. Not a battlefield, but Amara wasn't the same girl who had walked into that room months ago. She was more guarded now, her trust not so easily given, and yet her journal entries returned. She began writing again. Poems, essays, even short stories. One of them told the tale of a girl who planted seeds in a garden where no one believed anything could grow, and yet by the end the garden was blooming. Her writing began to reflect not just pain but hope. Meanwhile, the Unheard Voices Club organized a school-wide forum on equity and inclusion. They invited speakers, held panel discussions, and facilitated small group conversations. Amara gave the keynote address. She didn't read from a paper. This time she spoke from memory, from heart, from fire. She shared how it felt to have your hair labeled unprofessional, your questions called disruptions, your intellect treated as anomaly. She didn't name names, she didn't need to. The room was silent, listening, holding every word with reverence. When she finished, the applause was long and standing. In that moment, Amara saw faces she never expected to see. Clapping teachers who once avoided the conversation, students who had once dismissed her, not all but enough to know something was changing. One of the teachers, Ms. Jenkins from science, approached her afterward and said, "I didn't know what you were going through. I should have, I'm sorry." Amara nodded, accepting the apology without resentment. It was never about blaming everyone, it was about making people see what they had chosen not to. Then came the letter from the school board. It announced the implementation of new guidelines for cultural sensitivity training, a revised disciplinary protocol to address implicit bias, and the creation of a student advisory panel on equity inspired directly by the work of the Unheard Voices Club. Amara was named its first student chair. The letter didn't mention Mrs. Whitmore, but her absence was no longer a question she would not be. Returning one evening, Amara sat in her room flipping through the pages of her journal. The entries from the beginning of the year were raw, full of doubt and exhaustion. She remembered the days when she questioned whether speaking up was worth it. Now those pages felt like echoes of a girl who had to fight to find her place. A girl who had every reason to stay silent and chose not to. She thought of the students who would come after her. Black students with natural hair, students from immigrant families, students who would stand where she once stood and hopefully feel less alone because she had been there first. The next day at school, Amara saw her poem from the zine posted on the hallway bulletin board, surrounded by artwork from her. Peers above it was a new title, The Wall of Voice. It was a student-led initiative approved by Ms. Ray, who believed that school walls should reflect all the students inside them. For the first time, Amara felt like her school was becoming something it hadn't been before, not just a building with classrooms, but a place where stories mattered. She walked past the board, slowly reading each piece. One described the shame of bringing ethnic food to lunch and being laughed at, another detailed a memory of being called too dark by classmates. There were stories about gender identity, language barriers, economic struggles. Each one was a window into someone's truth, and together they formed a tapestry of resilience. Emily joined her at the board. "Can you believe this started with just your story?" she said. Amara smiled. "No, but I'm glad it did that weekend." Danielle took Amara shopping for a new notebook. "You're going to need this for all the chapters you haven't written yet." She said. Amara chose one with a soft leather cover and blank pages thick enough for ink as she walked through the aisles. She thought about everything that had brought her here, the silence, the resistance, the moments of doubt, and the triumphs. Hard. One, she wasn't just writing for herself anymore. She was writing for everyone who still needed to find the courage to speak. That night she opened to the first page and wrote a single sentence. "I am not your exception. I am the proof that we belong." The school was unusually quiet as the sun spilled through the windows of Lincoln High on that late spring morning, illuminating the specks of dust that danced in the air. It was the kind of silence that came before a storm, a stillness heavy with anticipation. For weeks now, the students and staff had existed in a fragile state of tension. The protests, the confrontations, the meetings, the whispered conversations in hallways, it all seemed to be building toward something. And now, as Principal Whitaker prepared for what he called the final address, Everyone knew that today was not just another school day. It was Judgment Day for Lincoln High and everything it stood for. Jada sat in her homeroom seat, her fingers curled tightly around her notebook. The scars of the last few weeks were still fresh. Micah's suspension had left a mark deeper than anyone could see. Though the school board had reinstated him after the backlash, the damage had already been done. The way some teachers looked at him now, either with guilt or avoidance, was proof that his presence was no longer invisible. But for Micah, invisibility had long been a kind of shield. Now that it was gone, everything felt exposed, raw, and vulnerable. Micah entered the room without speaking. He didn't need to. The silence greeted him the way applause once did for others. His eyes locked with Jada's for a moment, and in that brief exchange, she saw all the exhaustion he carried. He took his seat without a word. The weight he bore wasn't his alone anymore. Others had started to share it. Ava, Mr. Tran, even Caleb, who had gone from a hesitant ally to an unwavering supporter since the infamous school board meeting. In those early days, when the students had first walked out in protest of Micah's treatment, Caleb had been uncertain. He didn't fully understand what it meant to stand against a system he'd unknowingly benefited from his whole life. But listening to his friends, seeing the blatant disparities, watching Jada cry in the hallway while holding Micah's mother's trembling hand, that had changed something in him. He no longer saw himself as just a bystander. Now, he knew he was either part of the problem or part of the solution. There was no in-between. Down the hall, Principal Whitaker rehearsed his speech in front of the mirror in his office. He was tired. The last few weeks had aged him. He had once prided himself on running one of the most diverse and high-achieving schools in the county, a line he often repeated to journalists and parents alike. But now, that reputation was in ruins. The students had exposed what had been buried under platitudes and polished brochures, the racism baked into the school's very foundation. The suspensions, the arrests, the curriculum, the allocation of resources, all tilted, all skewed, all wrong. Today, he was supposed to make it right. But how? Words could only go so far. The board had issued its guidance. The district had offered its reprimands. And yet he knew the only judgment that mattered now was the one coming from the students, from Micah, from Jada, from everyone who had demanded change while risking their reputations, their safety, and their future. The intercom crackled to life. "All students and faculty, please proceed to the auditorium for a mandatory assembly," Whitaker's voice said, thin and tremulous, trying to mask his fear under layers of authority. The movement began slowly at first, then grew into a steady flow. Students emptied from classrooms, filing into the large auditorium, their voices hushed but their eyes alert. There was an energy in the air, not of chaos, but of clarity. Everyone knew this wasn't just an assembly, it was a confrontation. With truth, Micah walked with Jada, Ava, and Caleb at his side. The four had become something of a unit now, bonded not by popularity or shared interests, but by resistance. They had spent countless afternoons meeting with teachers, collecting testimonials, compiling data, and even securing a local journalist's promise to attend today's event. It had all built to this. As they entered the auditorium, Micah's mother sat near the back, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Mr. Tran stood near the faculty section, his eyes scanning the room for signs of discord. Ava's father, a lawyer, was also in attendance, having taken the day off work to support the cause his daughter had poured herself into. The lights dimmed slightly as Whitaker stepped onto the stage. He wore his usual suit and tie, but his shoulders sagged more than usual. Behind him, a screen displayed a simple phrase: "Lincoln High, facing our truth." He gripped the podium tightly. "Thank you all for coming. I know the past few weeks have been difficult, on students, staff, parents, and the community as a whole. I'm not here to pretend things are fine. They're not." A murmur moved through the crowd. Whitaker continued. "When Micah Jefferson was suspended, it wasn't just a disciplinary action. It was a reflection of a pattern this. school has allowed to continue for far too long. Over the last decade, black students at Lincoln High have been suspended at 3 times the rate of white students. They are underrepresented in honors classes and overrepresented in disciplinary referrals. These aren't opinions, these are facts. Micah stared straight ahead, his jaw set. I was part of that system, Whitaker said, and for that, I am deeply sorry. Silence. Then the screen behind him flickered, showing charts, testimonies, quotes from students and parents, all gathered and compiled by the Student Coalition over the past month. Jada recognized her own handwriting on one of the slides, a quote about being followed in the hallways by security guards while her white classmates weren't. The presentation lasted 5 full minutes. When it ended, Whitaker stepped back to the mic. We have failed many of you, not just recently, but consistently. And so today we announce a series of immediate changes. First, a third-party equity audit of all disciplinary actions, curriculum content, and hiring practices. Second, the establishment of a permanent student equity council with real decision-making power, chaired by students of color. Third, mandatory, anti-racism training for all staff and administrators. And fourth, a public apology to Micah Jefferson, which I now offer. He turned to look at Micah, who sat still, stunned. Micah, I am sorry. We got it wrong. I got it wrong. And I thank you for your courage, for your persistence, and for refusing to stay silent. The room remained hushed. Then a slow clap started in the back. Ava's father. Then Mr. Tran. Then others. Until finally, a standing ovation rippled through the auditorium. But Micah didn't stand. He didn't smile. He simply nodded. After the assembly, students spilled out into the hallways, buzzing with conversations. Some were hopeful, others were skeptical, and some were still angry. But one thing was undeniable. The veil had been lifted. No one could unsee what had been shown. Micah stood outside by the oak tree in the courtyard. Jada joined him, then Ava, then Caleb. You okay? Jada asked. I don't know, Micah said honestly. Part of me thought I'd feel better. That's because it's not over, Ava said. This is just the start. He nodded. I guess I just wanted them to see what it cost. They did, Caleb said, and they will keep seeing it because we're not going anywhere. In the weeks that followed, the changes began, slowly, haltingly, but genuinely. The equity audit exposed years of imbalance. Some teachers resigned, others doubled down on doing better. Students started showing up to the Equity Council meetings in large numbers. New books arrived in the library, ones that told fuller stories. And for the first time, the murals in Pointe-Digne, the school included faces that looked like Jada's, Micah's, and so many others. Not everyone welcomed the shift. A few parents complained, some board members resisted, but the tide had turned. The truth had been spoken, loudly, persistently, and in unison. On the last day of school, as students signed yearbooks and said their goodbyes, Micah lingered by his locker. Inside was a note taped to the door. He didn't recognize the handwriting. Teal. Read, you helped us see. Thank you. Keep going. No name, no signature, just truth. And sometimes truth was enough.